Hello, greetings, and welcome to day one of the Pride Study Wrapped Research Year in Review 2024. Just a quick note on our name, Wrapped is in reference to kind of the play on words how many streaming services offer a wrapped highlight of your year. It does not mean wrapped as in done. Don't worry, we're not going anywhere. This is a new webinar series that we launched to create more opportunities for the Pride Study to share research results back with the community and to build more touch points for researchers and community members to engage. My name is Daniel Moretti. I use all pronouns with positive intent, and I'm Program Management Director at PrideNet. A short visual description of myself is that I have brown curly hair, light brown skin, and I'm wearing a gray leopard print with gold chain t-shirt and a black blazer. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mitchell Lunn, co-director of the Pride Study in PrideNet, to provide brief welcome remarks.
Great. Thanks, Daniel. And thanks, everyone, for being here today, joining us for the Pride Study Wrapped Research Year in Review 2024. My name is Mitchell Lunn. I use he and him pronouns. I'm an associate professor here at Stanford. A visual description is I'm a middle-aged white guy with the kind of brown spiky hair and brown facial hair wearing a blue polo shirt today. We are very proud of and thankful for all the collaborators that have worked with us over the years, many of whom you'll hear from today. And since our first paper in 2019, we've now published 71 papers and look forward to continuing this productivity for the years to come while we continue our ongoing commitment to engage and partner with LGBT communities all along the way. We know that LGBTQIA plus communities, especially trans and gender diverse communities, are now under specific and directed attack. And so we need each other now more than ever. Thank you all for joining us today and for your continued support, participation, and dedication to making the world a better and healthier place for LGBTQIA plus people. Thanks so much, and I'll send it back to Daniel.
Thanks so much, Mitch. I'm going to quickly go over the agenda for today. First, we'll hear from Dr. Briana McGeough, who's going to talk about 12-step program participation in the LGBTQI plus community. Then we have Gowri Sunder, who is going to do two different studies. The first, substance use over time across gender among LGBTQI plus people. And the second, how stigma and discrimination relate to cannabis use over time among LGBTQI plus people. And last, we have Dr. Nick Metheny, who is presenting experiencing partner violence is related to more alcohol use among LGBTQS plus people in the Pride study. Just a quick note around the content. So the studies being presented may include sharing data about experiences of violence, discrimination, and/or substance use. We invite everyone to practice self-care in the way that is most supportive for them. Before we dive into the presentations, I wanted to provide some context on who we are. So first, we're going to start with PrideNet, and we're based out of Stanford Medicine, and we catalyze LGBTQI plus health research. We do this by connecting community members with ways to participate in trusted research, and we also create opportunities for community input to inform all stages in the research process. We're here, we're queer, and we refuse to be invisible in the data. One of the studies that PrideNet conducts community engagement for is the Pride Study, which is also based out of Stanford Medicine. We're also going to be focusing today's webinar on data and research that's come out of the Pride Study. The Pride Study is the first national online and long-term health study of LGBTQI plus physical, mental, and social health. Important to note is the Pride Study is created for us and by us. And participation in the Pride Study is primarily focused on completing one survey online every year. It takes about 45 minutes, and you may be invited to complete other surveys or participate in the Pride Study in other ways. Eligibility is open for anyone who identifies as part of the LGBTQI plus community or another sexual and gender minority, at least 18 years old, living in the US or territories, and comfortable reading and writing in English. Our current enrollment is 30,000 plus, but we might be missing you. If so, we invite you to learn more at pridestudy.org. We wanted to share more about the Pride study, but wanted to share from the perspective and voice of the many members who make up the PrideNet network. Here's a short 2-minute video sharing about what they like about the Pride study.
We live in a climate that is often not very affirming of our experiences and our identities, and the Pride study provides us the knowledge that people are out there fighting to make a difference within the future of health research. We're part of that change, and it helps us be a part of something bigger than ourselves.
It really emphasizes the importance of understanding these different intersectionalities for the group that they're doing research on.
It's specifically focused on the queer community, and they're really making sure that they're reaching all corners of the queer community. They're asking not just if you're gay or straight, but if you're trans or non-binary or asexual. Those small bits of inclusion are really important to those corners that haven't been really reached out to in the past.
It's also important that we have all aspects of the community represented, whether that's being neurodivergent, whether that's being trans, whether that's whatever other unique aspects of us there are.
Having everyone participate in studies such as the Pride study, it shows that each individual is different and unique in their own way.
Pride study makes me feel like there's opportunity involved for everybody who wants to be a part of something. A place where queer people are represented in a safe and equitable manner.
The Pride study takes care of my security and privacy in a way that nothing else of its nature that I've been involved with ever has. And that is one of the reasons I feel so comfortable recommending that others join.
Huge thank you to everyone that makes up the PrideNet network. I know some are on the webinar today, some are featured in the video, but there's many, many more. We could not do this work without you. We appreciate you. Thanks so much, everyone. With that, please join me in a warm welcome to our first presenter, Dr. Briana McGeough.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Daniel. It's a really honor to be here. As Daniel said, I'm Dr. Briana McGeough, she, her, hers. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Social Welfare at the University of Kansas, as well as the director for the Center for LGBTQ Research and Advocacy here. I'm a blonde white lady with shoulder-length hair. And it's cold in Kansas today, so I'm wearing not one, but 2 layers of flannel. And yeah, as mentioned, it's really wonderful to be here. I've been involved with the Pride study for a long time. I used Pride study data for my dissertation back in 2018. So I've been part of this process for a long time, and so it's really great to be here sharing another project with you all today. So today I'll be discussing 12-step program participation in the LGBTQIA community. And so in terms of what we did, we asked LGBTQIA plus folks about their alcohol and other substance use, as well as their experiences with 12-step programs, so things like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous. And the idea here was that this helped us get a better understanding of how well these programs work for members of the LGBTQIA community, as well as what experiences of social and community support members of the queer and trans community had in 12-step programs. So to me, this was a really important research project to undertake because, as many of us know, in a space like this, queer and trans folks are more likely to experience challenges with alcohol and other substances due to the hostile environments that we find ourselves in. And 12-step programs are far and away the most widely used resource in the United States for people who are wanting to make changes to their use of alcohol and other substances. And some past work has found, including some work that I've done, that queer and trans folks are more likely to use these programs than cisgender and heterosexual people. So it seems to me like a really big deal that we have folks who are potentially really in need of making use of these programs. And these programs are widely available and commonly utilized. And yet we really don't have very much research about how well 12-step programs work for LGBTQIA plus folks, as well as what kinds of experiences queer and trans folks have in these programs. So the goal of this study was really to try to begin to answer these questions. So what did we learn? In terms of the question of how well these programs work, overall, queer and trans folks who are experiencing challenges with alcohol and other substances who were more involved in 12-step programs showed more improvement with their substance use than members who were less active. And by more involved, I mean things like attended more meetings, engaged in activities like reading program literature, volunteering to set up the coffee or chairs at meetings, or working with a sponsor or sponsee. That sort of doing these sort of additional things and being more actively present in the program was associated with greater reductions in substance use in folks who did fewer of those things. And then I think the kind of complicated question about what kinds of experiences do queer and trans folks have in 12-step programs. And ultimately, we learned that queer and trans folks have diverse experiences that range from really positive experiences to really negative experiences, as well as a combination of both positive and negative experiences. So noting that this is a complicated picture, and I think there's a lot of nuance in terms of how folks experience the program. In terms of positive experiences, folks reported a sense of community and really bonding over shared experiences, as well as learning new skills to manage both stress related to being a queer and trans person in an oppressive world, but also new skills in terms of managing substance use, coping with urges to use, things like that. But unfortunately, some respondents also reported negative experiences, and these included discrimination in the context of meetings around being an LGBTQIA plus person, as well as other intersections of identity. So folks also sometimes experienced instances of racism in meetings. There were also reports of experiences of violence, harassment, and bullying. And so to capture a little bit of what folks said in their own words, an example of someone reporting a positive experience was, I love having people who support me and that I know I can call at any time if I'm struggling. For me with bipolar disorder, staying connected is especially important because I can easily bounce from one extreme to the other and not notice it. But my friends in the program look out for me now. And so this is an example of something that we saw a lot of, which was not only was the program helpful and supportive for this participant around their substance use, but also challenges with social isolation as well as other mental health conditions that they were wrestling with. But unfortunately, that wasn't necessarily a universal experience. Another participant said, I felt like the program itself was very oppressive. There was rampant homophobia in meetings that were not specifically designed to welcome folks who are LGBTQ+. And even within those groups, there were a number of incredibly toxic behaviors that were allowed to go unchecked. And so unfortunately for this participant, engagement in the program wasn't a favorable experience, and they noted oppression around a range of axes of identity. So, this wasn't a clear sort of black and white outcome of research, and that we saw sort of generally folks saw improvement in substance use. We saw some folks who had really favorable and meaningful connections with the program, and folks who unfortunately also had fairly violent experiences as well. So what does this mean for our communities then? I think 12-step programs can be helpful for LGBTQIA plus people who are experiencing challenges with alcohol and other substance use, but unfortunately, again, that finding isn't universal. And while some queer and trans folks have beneficial experiences, others may have harmful experiences. So some recommendations, again, I think in terms of trying to navigate some of this nuance is when possible, I do recommend queer and trans folks try to attend multiple groups. I think, as with kind of any space in our society, these groups can vary widely. And so I think it can be useful to attend multiple groups, potentially even multiple LGBTQ specific meetings, to see if there are ones where folks feel more supported. I also recommend considering potentially alternative sources of support as well. Like, it became pretty clear from this project that 12-step programs absolutely weren't for everyone. And there are other resources available to folks who are interested in trying to work on their substance use. So traditional therapy can be a valuable resource for some folks, though acknowledging that it may not be accessible to everyone. And then there are also other mutual help groups for substance use that employ different approaches, such as Smart Recovery, which is another program that I research, LifeRing, Refuge Recovery, etc. So I think if folks participate in 12-step programs and realize they're not for them, considering some of these other resources may be meaningful. And then lastly, noting that, I think some of those reports of harmful experiences could be really damaging to folks. And so encouraging folks who have had negative experiences, who feel really harmed by those, to potentially pursue additional support, such as therapy for healing from those experiences, because I think it's really important that folks get the support they need around that piece of this as well. So, in terms of what's next, I'd love to compare how effective 12-step programs are for queer and trans folks relative to other mutual help groups for substance use, such as Smart Recovery. And I would also like to get a better understanding of which members of the queer and trans community are most likely to have positive experiences in the program. Again, to, I think, help folks make more informed decisions around which resource might be best for them. Also, I think this can be helpful for service providers such as therapists to have a sense of which referrals might be most helpful to their clients. And ultimately, I would love to better understand how to make mutual help groups like 12-step programs, Smart Recovery, and others more inclusive and effective for queer and trans people. And I think with an emphasis on queer and trans people who hold multiple intersecting marginalized identities so that folks can get the support they need in trying to make changes around substance use. So that was all I had in terms of presentation, and so would love to answer any questions folks might have. Thank you so much.
Huge thanks, Dr. Briana. Really appreciate it. We do have quite a bit of questions, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with the first one. Was your study able to look up folks who attend LGBTQ specific meetings versus general 12-step meetings? I'm curious how many people take advantage of LGBTQ meetings or those who have to those who have to make other meetings work.
Yes, so this has been an interesting shift. I started doing this work, I think, in 2017, and so the landscape has shifted a lot. And it used to really be that folks kind of only had access to LGBTQ specific meetings in urban areas, and that folks would potentially have to drive 2 hours to get to an LGBTQ meeting if that was important to them. We've seen some proliferation of LGBTQ specific meetings, but I think the bigger shift has been that increasingly those can be available online. And I think that's its own sort of set of trade-offs. I think some folks find some real benefits to participating in an online environment. Other folks just find that some of that kind of meaningful connection is a little bit harder to cultivate. So accessibility of these meetings is a real challenge. I was actually surprised to learn that I think of the folks who had attended 12-step meetings in this sample, I believe up to 70% of them had attended at least one LGBTQ specific meeting. I think another thing that was a little bit challenging to sort of observe was that folks attending the queer specific meetings still actually often had, unfortunately, reports of difficult and painful experiences, specifically, I think, around issues of racism and transphobia, that it seems as though there's still a lot of work to be done there to make that an inclusive space. The other thing that popped up a lot around participating in LGBTQ specific meetings was matters of privacy, that often those meetings can be pretty small. And I think, say, if one's coming at it from like a mid-sized town, that like that queer recovery scene is not very big. And I think folks often felt that people from other facets of their life, such as, yeah, people they used to maybe date or things like that, were very present. And so some folks had opted to not attend these meetings out of concerns of sort of privacy and sort of small community things.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And a question that came through that is somewhat related. Someone asked, was the data, did the survey, did it come from all over the US or only specific regions?
All over the US. So it was sort of the Pride study distributed my kind of additional 12-step questions. And so, yeah, it was all over the United States. I didn't do too much geographic analysis, but we did have a pretty good diversity of region and urban and rural participants.
Great. And that was the kind of dovetail to the next question about any rural/urban and or regional differences when it comes to positive, negative experience or accessibility. But it sounds like what you mentioned was not so much of a focus for this study. Is that right?
Yep, that's correct.
Great. Another question is, someone says, I'm curious if there has been any consideration of mapping the experiences of outcomes of LGBTQI plus people involved in 12 Steps programs. It would be interesting to see regional trends so that more educational outreach to program leadership in areas with a higher percentage of negative experiences might occur. So I think that kind of dovetails what you were mentioning earlier, right? That maybe regional might be things, to look at in another study.
Yeah, that's true. But yeah, I think that's really important because, yeah, it did seem as though from a cursory sort of consideration of that there are probably differences, but you haven't systematically looked at that yet.
Great. And we have another question, and maybe this gets into their next steps, but it says, are there other types of programs that resonate better than 12-step programs with LGBTQ plus community?
That's a great question. So, I did get to look at this a little bit through the study and more substantively with some of my other work. And so I think one thing worth noting is that I made a bar chart of sort of participation in these programs and things like LifeRing, Smart Recovery, which is a cognitive behavioral program, Refuge Recovery. A really tiny fraction of folks who had attended 12-step meetings had participated in any of these other programs. So noting that I think there's just considerably less proliferation of some of these programs. But I had asked some questions specifically about Smart Recovery, and was able to do a little bit of comparison between folks' responses with 12-step and SMART. And I would say for the most part, and again, noting that it's a considerably smaller group of people, but for the most part, experiences were a lot less all over the place with SMART, that I think they probably aired overall a little bit more favorably. But I think that also kind of depended on sort of priorities. So things that 12-step programs seem to do really well when they work well are creating intensive networks of social support. And so folks who are really looking to connect with other people in intensive and meaningful ways seem to most favor 12-step programs. Folks who are looking a little bit more for, I think for folks for whom like religious trauma was a considerable factor, or folks who just out of philosophical beliefs wanted a more secular program, tended to really prefer the SMART framework. The SMART framework was, I think, also pretty resonant to folks who had previously benefited from cognitive behavioral therapy in the past and folks who just really liked having kind of discrete actionable tools to use. And so for folks who are maybe less invested in being like an intensive recovery community, that seemed to be a really good option for them. And I think also I've been looking at recently some ways to try to make that program a little bit more explicitly inclusive of some of the challenges that queer folks experience that maybe bring them to recovery resources in the first place.
Thank you so much. And our last question, was there any differences related between different types of 12-step groups? So for example, AA, NA, MA, CA, etc.
It actually didn't pop up a lot. Like I had done a little bit of analysis, trying to look at differences across groups, and I wasn't actually seeing a ton come up. That said, I'll note that it wasn't a primary focus of the study, but the little bit of exploratory work I did didn't highlight big differences there.
Great. And I misspoke. I have one more.
Okay.
This is
Sure,
the
great.
actual final, but it's great, sparking a lot of your important research is sparking a lot of great questions and considerations. So, any observations about sponsors? Typically, in traditional meetings, sponsors are same gender to avoid sexual line crossing, but with queer folks, maintaining same gender sponsors would not necessarily accomplish that purpose. Does ensuring gender/sexual orientation lack a potential for sexual line crossing matter for beneficial matching to a sponsor for queer folk?
Yes, this came up a lot, and I don't actually have an answer to the question of like what sort of gender configuration is most effective. But it definitely showed up very understandably as just kind of feeling like another axis of exclusion for queer and trans folks. So I think folks just felt very, again, understandably that there was a pretty heteronormative assumption in that. And then I think for gender expansive folks where they're, where most meetings don't necessarily have something outside of a like dichotomous male-female sponsorship list, it just felt very exclusionary. And so, yeah, in terms of what gender configuration of sponsors, I don't know, but I do think that the current structure can feel particularly exclusionary for non-binary folks, and then also just kind of feel pretty heteronormative in its assumptions.
Great. Well, huge thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Please join me in giving snaps, throwing some glitter, light up the chat. You can use your little heart emojis. Huge thanks to Dr. Briana McGeough for all the great work that you're doing, your important research, and for being here to share it with us today.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
Great. Well, continuing on with the webinar, it is my pleasure to introduce my amazing colleague, Gowri Sunder. And I'm going to go ahead and share slides. And go ahead, Gowri, just let me know when it's time to move on through the slides.
Sounds good. Thanks, Daniel. Hi, everyone. I'm Gowri. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a research associate working with the Pride Study and Dr. Anissa Flengy at UC San Francisco. I have shoulder length curly black hair. I'm wearing a cream sweater, silver jewelry. And yeah, thank you all for being here today. Today, I'm going to be talking about two studies that are focused on stigma and substance use among LGBTQIA plus people. So next slide, please. So kind of backdropping this work is research which shows that substance use disparities are prevalent among LGBTQIA plus populations. What that means is that rates of substance use and substance use disorders have been shown to be high among LGBTQIA plus communities. There are a lot of factors which might influence someone's substance use behavior. So that could be biological, like how substances are processed by our bodies. That could be social, like the networks and social norms around how we use substances. And that can be psychological, like using substances to cope with difficult emotions like sadness or anxiety. One of the kind of big theories in why substance use is so high among many LGBTQI plus populations is related to stigma. The idea that stigma and discrimination create an extra burden, which leads to elevated substance use. And so our goal in these studies was to answer some of the unanswered questions around substance use and stigma among LGBTQI plus communities to hopefully further our understanding in the ways we design support systems and services for folks in our community. So those kind of questions that underlie these research, first is how does stigma impact substance use over time? So there's been some research which shows that substance use increases within the short term, like within a day or so after someone experiences discrimination. But we need a little more research to understand what the long-term impact of stigma is on our substance use. There's also questions about differences within communities within the LGBTQI plus community. So there's been some work which shows that there are differences in substance use within different communities, but there's just more work that is needed to understand this better. And then finally, a lot of research for a variety of reasons really looks at one substance. So there's a lot of research, for instance, looking at specifically alcohol use. But we also need research that looks on the use of multiple substances, also known as polysubstance use, because the different substances people use in combination might have specific and important health impacts. So with that, I will dive into the first study. Next slide, please. So this first study was looking at substance use over time across gender among LGBTQIA+ people. Next slide, please. So the research question here was, are there differences by gender in substance use for LGBTQIA+ people in the PRIDE study? So if you're a part of the PRIDE study, you might know that every year you get an annual questionnaire. And so this study used 4 years of annual questionnaire survey data from 2017 to 2020 to look at the use of 15 different substances. Then we looked at differences by gender groups. And here we look at specifically differences by gender and sex assigned at birth. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, but I just want to note that these categories are imperfect ways to look at this, but we looked at gender and sex assigned at birth because historically research and clinical guidelines really focus on binary sex, which is one of the gaps that our research hopes to address in the future. But here we looked at differences by these groups. So cisgender men, cisgender women, gender expansive people assigned female at birth, gender expansive people assigned male at birth, transgender men, and transgender women. And this study included 11,822 people. Next slide, please. So what we did is we had a bunch of data, and to kind of find the different patterns of substance use of these 15 substances over 4 years, we used a statistical technique which allows you to find patterns in these kind of big data sets. And so using this technique, we found 8 patterns of substance use over time. And so these are numbered from the largest, the most common pattern to the smallest pattern. So the most common pattern that we saw in the PRIDE study was folks using little or no substances. The second most common was defined by mostly heavy alcohol use. The third most common was defined by mostly cannabis use. The fourth, mostly cannabis use, heavy alcohol use, and tobacco use together. The fifth was primarily prescription stimulant use. So that's things like Adderall, which increased over time. The sixth most common was sedative use, so things like sleeping pills, also increasing over time. The seventh most common pattern was mostly tobacco use with some other substance use. And finally, the least common pattern of substance use that we saw was defined by mostly popper use or inhaled nitrite use. Next slide, please. So to dive a little deeper into what these patterns look like, I'm going to highlight the 4 most common patterns here that we saw in the PRIDE study from 2017 to 2020. So these are the top most common patterns of substances. And just to orient you a little bit on how to read these graphs. So each, looking at the first most common pattern defined by little or no substance use, there were 5,763 people who are likely to endorse this pattern of substance use. And so on the x-axis or the horizontal axis, you can see there are 4 years representing the 4 years of annual questionnaire data. And on the y-axis or the vertical axis, you can see that there are different percentages, and these represent the percentages of people within this kind of pattern or this group were endorsing each of these 15 substances. And then at the very bottom of this slide, you can see there are colorful boxes that correspond to different substances. And so this just helps you know when you're looking at these graphs, which of the color bars corresponds to which of the substances. So in this first graph for little or no substance use, you can see that the bars are very low, which is how we identified this as a pattern defined by little or no substance use. The next most common pattern was alcohol use with some tobacco and cannabis use. And 1,683 people were likely to belong to this pattern of substance use. So you can see here the yellow gold bar shows that about over 75% across all 4 years reported using heavy alcohol use. And then a smaller percentage of people reported tobacco and cannabis use here. The third most common pattern was defined by mostly cannabis use with some tobacco and alcohol use declining over time. And so 1,570 people likely belong to this pattern of substance use. And finally, the fourth most common pattern was defined by mostly cannabis, alcohol, and tobacco use with some polysubstance use. And 645 people likely endorsed this pattern of substance use. Okay, so next slide, please. So after identifying these 8 different patterns of substance use, we looked at gender differences across these different types of these patterns of substance use. And what we found is that cisgender men were more likely than other gender groups to report the pattern defined by heavy alcohol use. We found that gender expansive people and trans men were more likely than other gender groups to report primarily cannabis use. We found that cisgender women, gender expansive people assigned female at birth, and trans men were less likely than other groups to report heavy alcohol, cannabis, and tobacco use. Next slide, please. We also found that gender expansive people were more likely to report primarily prescription stimulant use, so things like Adderall. We found that gender expansive people assigned female at birth were more likely to report primarily sedative or sleeping pill use. And finally, we found that cisgender women were less likely than other groups to report primarily tobacco use. Next slide, please. So that was a lot of information. What are the main takeaways here? I think the most important takeaway here is that there are differences by substance use, by gender among LGBTQIA plus groups, and importantly, that looking at expansive gender identities is really important in substance use research. And like I said, we used gender groups that were looking at both gender identity and sex assigned at birth, which is an imperfect way to try to understand what drives these gender differences. And so we're doing some work within the Pride study to try to understand the kind of biological underpinnings of why these gender differences might be occurring, as well as the psychological and social factors that might be underlying these gender differences. It's also important to note that these differences occur with kind of different combinations of different substances, so that there is an importance to looking at substance use that considers the use of multiple substances. And then finally, the next step, I think, where we go from here is that we need to really understand what drives these differences and what drives problematic substance use, things that are creating suffering and problems for folks, in order to better design our prevention and supportive services. So with that, I'll pause if folks have questions.
Thanks so much, Gowri. So we do have a question in the chat. And actually, we had the pleasure of just talking about this study at the Creating Change conference this week. And this same question came up, so I think it's likely on the minds of a lot of people. So the question is, were the use of prescription opioids, stimulants, and sedatives/sleeping pills broken out between the categories of use as prescribed, use but not as prescribed, and non-prescribed use?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So these patterns shown here include, from a follow-up question, we learned that it included folks who are using their medications as prescribed, as well as folks who aren't. And a majority of people reported using their medications as described. And just to kind of tack on, this wasn't a part of the question, but I think it's also important to note that when we were looking at alcohol use or cannabis use, we looked at heavy alcohol use, but we weren't looking at, for instance, problematic cannabis use among the other substances as well. But thank you, that's a good question.
Yeah, thanks so much, Gowri. The next question is, has the data been broken down by age?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In this particular study, we didn't look at age, but I think that future work with substance use is definitely considering age because there are differences developmentally in how people use substances.
Thank you so much. And then feel free if folks have additional questions to write in the chat or in the Q&A. One last question. And this came up also when we were presenting at the conference. So some people had shared, kind of the use of substance sometimes is self-perceived as something that isn't necessarily, a health disparity or a negative. That, sometimes it could be used to be able to better engage with folks, or, that there could be some positive, kind of motivations. Do you know if any of the data that was collected or for future studies that there might be, kind of looking at those nuances when it comes to substance use?
Yeah, for sure. We're going to maybe touch on this a little bit in the next study we talk about too. But this particular study doesn't look at sort of like how people are viewing their substance use. And like I said, it's also not really thinking about like if there's like clinical concerns if people are using their substances. And so I think what you described of people might think about their substance use differently, and it may not, like for instance, going to a gay bar one night might feel like a really good thing for some folks and might create challenges for others. And so I think it's really important for future research to really look into these things, and there are different ways to look at that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Gowri. We're going to go ahead and move into your double feature, your second study. Thank you so much.
Sure. All right. So this next study is really focusing on cannabis use. And our goal here was to look at stigma and discrimination in relation to cannabis use over time. So next slide, please. So our research question here was, how does discrimination and stigma relate to patterns of cannabis use over 4 years? And so to answer this question, we looked at the stigma and discrimination data in 2017 to create what we called like a minority stress score, which basically included 4 different types of experiences related to stigma and discrimination. So first, we looked at different kinds of past year discrimination and victimization. We also looked at internalized stigma. So that's kind of like negative feelings about being LGBTQIA+. We also looked at outness, or in other words, the ways and people's comfort with sharing their LGBTQIA+ identity, and the ways people might hide their LGBTQIA+ identity. And finally, we looked at safety and acceptance within one's current communities. And so looking at all of these things from 2017, we kind of we wanted to learn how those related to people's cannabis use risk over the 4 years from 2017 to 2020. Next slide, please. So first, we looked at the different patterns of cannabis use over these 4 years and found 5 patterns of cannabis use. So about 77.7% reported low or no risk. And just a note, when we're talking about risk here, that's lower risk means less cannabis use or less problems reported due to their cannabis use. 12.7% reported low moderate risk, 6% reported moderate but higher risk, 2% were kind of in this highest risk group, and 1.7% exhibited an increase in risk from 2017 to 2020 that was pretty stark, from pretty low risk to fairly high risk. Next slide, please. So after identifying the different patterns of cannabis use over time, we then looked at how discrimination and stigma predicted these risks. So past year discrimination, mistreatment, and victimization was related to greater odds of moderate and high risk patterns of cannabis use. We found that internalized stigma, or negative beliefs about being LGBTQIA+, was related to high moderate risk and high risk of cannabis use. We found that living in a safe community was related to lower odds of low moderate risk compared to low or no risk of cannabis use. And we found that concealing one's LGBTQIA+ identity was related to lower odds of high moderate risk of cannabis use. Next slide, please. So after looking at how stigma and discrimination relate to these 4 years of cannabis use risk, we tried to see if there were gender differences that persisted even after accounting for stigma and discrimination. And what we found is that accounting for stigma and discrimination, transgender men and gender expansive people reported more cannabis use or cannabis use related problems. We also found that there was no difference in cannabis use risk by sex assigned at birth among gender expansive people. Next slide, please. So the takeaways here, I think first is that there might be long-term impacts of discrimination and stigma, and that reducing and providing support for discrimination and stigma may be an important piece of preventing difficulties with cannabis use. Another takeaway is that there may be differences in risk of cannabis use by gender, even after accounting for stigma and discrimination. And so I think more work needs to happen to really understand these differences, to understand why these differences may exist and what specific communities may need in terms of support for discrimination and stigma and support for cannabis use. And finally, I think an important next step for our research is to understand what may change the risk of cannabis use over time. I think we were really interested in learning more about what might, be going on with the group of folks who showed that steep increase from 2017 to 2020 in cannabis use risk. So with that, I'll open it up for folks to ask questions.
Thanks again so much, Gowri. So we do have a couple questions. I'll go ahead and stop sharing the screen real quick. So the first one is, someone shared, many of us see widespread paired dysfunctional / addictive behaviors referred to as chemsex, parentheses, commonly meth. Wondering if there were any observations of this population in your findings, even if it didn't show up in your top 8.
That's a good question. I think, like I said, we did see that there were gender differences that seem to appear in our research, but we're going to do more research to really understand that. And some of our work, if folks with biological kind of data and trying to understand the relationship of sex and hormones and all these different experiences with substance use, is something planned down the line to really understand better.
Thanks so much, Gowri. And, just want to emphasize that this study and many others, this is really groundbreaking and it's foundational, and it just highlights, like what you're saying, more studies to be done, further research. So it's just really exciting. Okay, next question that we have, was there any breakdown of the types of discriminatory experience? So for example, job discrimination versus social exclusion, violence, or online abuse?
Yes, that's a really good question. So that first kind of group of type of minority stress in the minority stress score that you might have seen in the diagram, it encompassed a bunch of questions asking about different kinds of discrimination experiences. So just to name a few, that includes discrimination in your job, in healthcare settings. I believe there's also a question about discrimination by law enforcement and things like that.
Thank you so much. So another question is, has the data been sifted by states where cannabis is legal, medical only, or illegal?
That's a really good question. We didn't do that in this study, but I think it's an important question. One of the findings that I didn't highlight here is that there was some sense that cannabis use is higher in places where community acceptance might be higher. And so one of our questions is, cannabis use laws and affirming LGBTQIA plus policies, there might be they might be more common in the same place. So it would be really interesting to see if there are differences in places where there are different cannabis use policies.
Great, thanks so much. And I see another question. I think this is, my interpretation is answered by your previous answer, but I'll share it just in case there's anything additional you would want to add. So it says, with this cannabis study, were there any data obtained about people in medical places versus adult use places versus illegal cannabis places?
Yeah, I think just to reiterate my last answer, I think, we didn't look at it in this study, but I think it's an important question. And also maybe a thing to add on is I think an interesting question would be to think about stigma that LGBTQ folks experience and stigma folks who use substances, might be overlap and unique experiences related to that, especially in places where that's not legal. Yeah.
Well, thank you again so much. We got through all of the really great questions. Thanks so much, attendees, for all the great questions and surfacing, some great areas for further inquiry. Everyone, let's go ahead and give some snaps and throw some glitter to Gowri. And huge thanks for the work that you and all the colleagues that worked on these studies provided. Thanks for being here to share with us.
Thanks, everyone.
Great. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our final study for today's webinar. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nick Metheny.
Hi, I'm Nick Metheny. I'm an assistant professor at the Emory University School of Nursing. I use he, him pronouns, and today I'm wearing a green shirt, and I usually have black hair, but I've shaved it all off. So today I wanted to chat about a study that we published regarding experiencing partner violence, sometimes called intimate partner violence, sometimes called domestic violence, and how it's related to more alcohol use among people in the Pride study, that is LGBTQIA people nationwide in the Pride study. So our research question was really, what is the relationship between past year partner violence and next year alcohol use? So this is a what we call longitudinal study. So we're looking at if you experienced intimate partner violence in 2021, whether you had higher alcohol use in 2022 than people who did not experience intimate partner violence. But before we get into the study itself, I want to make sure we're all familiar with what the definitions that I'll be talking about are. So partner violence is defined by the World Health Organization as any action within a romantic relationship that causes physical, sexual, or emotional harm to those in the relationship. This is often operationalized as physical, sexual, emotional violence, as well as controlling and stalking behaviors. You can see some examples there on the screen. And what we're finding out, the more research we do, is that LGBTQIA plus people experience especially high rates of partner violence. And there are differences within our community on the subpopulations that experience intimate partner violence. For example, transgender people are more likely to experience intimate partner violence than heterosexual and cisgender counterparts of any sexual orientation. We also know that partner violence can lead to a lot of negative health impacts. We haven't done much research on this in cisgender or in LGBTQIA folks, but we have really good evidence that it leads to some pretty bad things in cisgender women who are in relationships with cisgender men. And you can see on the screen some of the health impacts that we know stem from experiencing intimate partner violence. And a lot of these are likely due to a stress response that people exhibit after experiencing something traumatic like partner violence. So anxiety and depression and other mental health effects, but also things like alcohol use disorder, which is what we're zeroing in on in this study. And if you have other questions about intimate partner violence and its health effects, I'm happy to talk about that. But specific to alcohol use, LGBTQIA people already have higher rates of alcohol use in a lot of cases than other populations. And part of that's because LGBTQIA plus youth often begin using substances earlier than others. And a lot of that is because of what other people have talked about as a response to some of the minority and structural stress that people experience when they're part of these communities. We also noticed that alcohol use escalates more quickly in these communities than in non-LGBTQIA folks. And again, that's linked to heightened exposure to societal stress. We're also finding out, and the Surgeon General of the United States a couple of months ago made this announcement you may have heard, that there's no such thing as a safe level of alcohol consumption. And while socializing and social support that often centers around alcohol can be helpful for some people. Biologically speaking, we're finding out that contrary to what we may have heard in the past, no level of alcohol consumption is actually safe for our health. So understanding how things like partner violence affect alcohol consumption is really important for understanding long-term health impacts. So we think there are two possible ways and so that alcohol use and partner violence can be related. And the first is probably the stereotypical story that you know of, which is where you have a opposite sex couple and usually the male in the relationship comes home inebriated with alcohol or other substances and then uses violence against his female partner. Sometimes there are children present and they see what's happening, and that happens all the time. But we're also wondering and finding out that the reverse pathway is also possible. That means that the trauma and stress of experiencing partner violence, especially if it's repeated and chronic, can lead to alcohol use, at least in opposite sex couples. So we're wondering if that's also the case in LGBTQIA folks. And that's important because understanding whether that pathway exists can help us understand whether IPV prevention and healing interventions are one way to possibly reduce alcohol and substance use in survivors of intimate partner violence who are LGBTQIA. So our analysis looked at 3,783 Pride Study participants, and we looked at that very pathway. We wanted to understand whether partner violence experienced in 2021 led to more alcohol use in 2022, and we controlled for all of those things in the green box in the middle so that we knew that it wasn't related to their age or their gender identity group or their sexual orientation, their education, their income, or their employment, which are also things that can add stress to your life and increase your alcohol use. So we wanted to make sure that it wasn't due to any of those things. And what we found out was that intimate partner violence in general, was pretty high in Pride Study participants. About 1 in 4 people reported some type of intimate partner violence in 2021. The majority of this, about 24% of people reported emotional intimate partner violence, that is humiliation or harassment from a partner. But surprisingly, over 20% of the sample, some 772 people, reported being sexually assaulted or having experienced sexual violence at the hands of their intimate partner. So really high levels of really serious stuff happening in our communities. We also found, after we did those analyses, that experiencing intimate partner violence in 2021 did lead to heavier drinking in 2022. And we can see this on the table by the red box showing that for each point on the violence scale that we used, which indicates the frequency of partner violence you experienced, your audit score or the level of alcohol that you reported increased by 0.32 points. And that expanded for each, or that was true of each type of partner violence, although sexual violence had the largest effect of 1.76 points on the Odyssey scale if you reported experiencing sexual violence. We also found that this pattern persisted across LGBTQIA gender groups, but in different ways, which I thought was really interesting. And so we found that cisgender men in the Pride study had the largest increase in alcohol use post-violence overall. But cisgender women had larger increases in alcohol use after sexual and physical violence, whereas transgender men, for example, had increased alcohol use only after emotional partner violence. And so what this tells us is a couple of things. One is that our communities are certainly not a monolith, and there's different ways that violence affects our stress response behaviors. But also, it probably tells us that we're not capturing the nuances of what violence looks like in each of our communities. And so if you're gender diverse, transgender, the types of violence that you may be most sensitive to could be different than if you were a cisgender man or a cisgender woman, for instance. And so having better measures to look at what violence looks like in our communities is super important for pinpointing the right ways to intervene. As with all Pride study, we had a really great diverse sample of LGBTQIA plus people across the entire US. And a lot of that is thanks to the participants and you all who fill out the annual questionnaires every year. So please keep doing that. Looking at this in a temporal way, meaning being able to say that X led to Y rather than just these two things were related to each other, is a strength of our study. And we also use some pretty robust statistical methods. However, the measurement of intimate partner violence that we used is not validated, meaning it wasn't tested in LGBTQIA plus people. So again, we're probably not catching all of the types of violence that exist in our communities. And with other Pride study studies, there's less racial and ethnic diversity than we'd like to see. And also, as with younger people across the United States, there's a low and decreasing level of alcohol use among Gen Z. And so that meant that the increases and decreases in alcohol use that we saw may not be as meaningful clinically as they are statistically. So we learned that partner violence is definitely an important factor in alcohol use in LGBTQIA plus communities. And the rates of partner violence are pretty high. And that experiencing partner violence led on average to higher alcohol use in the next year across all of our communities. And this now means that we know both of those pathways are valid. So alcohol use can lead to partner violence and partner violence can lead to alcohol use. But the type of violence matters by community. This means that we need better community-specific measures of partner violence and that substance use services could benefit from including content specific to those who have experienced partner violence as a way to increase their ability to heal and reduce substance use if that's what they'd like to do. But the inverse is also true. Reducing partner violence in our communities could also help reduce levels of alcohol and other substance use. I'm happy to answer any questions, and you can use the QR code there to read the whole paper if you'd like.
Thank you so much, Dr. Metheny. We have a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and start with the first one, which is someone shared, I'm surprised at the high level of sexual IPV, intimate partner violence. I wonder what types of behaviors comprised this category?
Yeah, it's a really good question because the annual questionnaire is a pretty lengthy survey. We didn't want to hound a lot of the Pride participants with a really long questionnaire. And so we used this really brief screener of intimate partner violence. That meant that our sexual IPV questionnaire is quite broad. It's only a single item and it asks whether you've experienced sexual assault or been made to do anything that you didn't want to do sexually. I might be paraphrasing the exact wording, but it's quite broad. And so I think that that is encompassing a lot of different things for a lot of different people. So it might be a slightly, I won't say inflated, but broader definition of sexual IPV than we might automatically think of.
Thanks so much. And a reminder to folks, attendees, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A function or in the chat box here. Our next question is, someone said, was there any breakdown of the results according to race and ethnicity?
Yes. The results according to race, ethnicity, and gender identity are in the supplemental materials for the paper. So if you use that QR code, you can see all of the tables and how they break down. I can't remember exactly what the results were, but you can certainly see them at the QR code. And we tried to disaggregate that as much as possible so that we could, again, pinpoint which communities might be most in need of intervention.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. And wanted to send a reminder for folks that the QR code in the presentation could get to the full paper, as well as we've included, my colleague Alex included links in the chat for the community-friendly summary, as well as the link to the manuscript. These will also be included with everyone as we do send out the recordings and materials. All right, we have another question, which is someone shared, baby boomers are aging out. Was age data reviewed?
We included age as a control variable, which means that we statistically controlled for the different ages people were at when they took the annual questionnaire. So we know that the results are not different by age. Well, that's not true. We know that the results are valid in spite of how old you were when you took the study. But we didn't disaggregate the results based on age category. So we don't know, for instance, whether like IPV was much higher in those who were 40 to 50 than in those who were 18 to 24. We have like the prevalence rates, but we don't really have the model estimates for alcohol use and IPV together. And plus, the Pride study is pretty heavily young people, and so there's a lot more like young people in the survey than people at the upper end of the age range.
Great. And we have another question, some praise. Thank you for your work. The audit C has different cutoffs for men and women for risk levels. How do you suggest controlling for this factor in studies looking at gender diverse populations?
Yeah, that is a question for alcohol researchers, which I am not. But that is something that we certainly need to consider, because one of the recommendations for the companion paper to this one, which is coming out soon and is about substances other than alcohol. So it's the same analysis, but just looking at other substances. There are like clinically different recommendations depending on how much you use a particular substance, what gender you are. And so you're right that like we don't have great criteria for how to go about doing that if you are gender expansive and gender diverse. And so that's certainly something we need to look into, but not my area of expertise. So I will not attempt to provide advice.
Can
And
I
I
hop in
thought,
real
I
quick?
feel like Briana might be a
like
better person to talk about that.
Dr. McGeough was like, I've been summoned, I heard. So
Yes, exactly.
Yes. Actually, Anissa and the Pride Study team did a really interesting study looking at gender expansive folks and the audit. And so I won't say the specifics of that paper, but there actually is a little bit of work that I find really encouraging that this measure can be used to evaluate how alcohol is impacting gender expansive folks without some gross misgendering. And so I think that's another exciting place where the Pride Study can be helpful.
fantastic. Thank you so much for jumping in and sharing that. All right, well, please join me in a round of applause and snaps and throwing glitter to Dr. Metheny for all of your great work and for being here and being so gracious with your time to share about the important and impactful research that you're doing. We appreciate you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Great. And so we're not quite done yet. We invite you to stay connected with PrideNet and the Pride Study across all social media platforms. Our handle is at the Pride Study. Alex, who has been posting all the links in the chat, does a great job of providing a lot of engaging content, updates on our events, activities, webinars such as this. If you want to contact us, you can email us at pridenetconnect@stanford.edu, and highly encourage you to sign up for the PrideNet newsletter if you haven't. Here's where you'll get updates about research findings as they come out, where we're going to be across the country, whether in person or online events, and other resources from our partners. So the link to sign up for the newsletter is in the chat and also here in the QR code. And then lastly, we invite you to join us. If you are a researcher and you're looking at, potentially collaborations with research or conducting research with the Pride Study data, the QR code on the left, as well as the link that Alex provided in the chat, will tell you more about the research collaboration process. And if you're not already a Pride Study participant and you want to learn more or consider signing up, the QR code on the right will bring you to the link that Alex has also posted in the chat. Really, by participating in the Pride Study, you are making possible more research such as that was presented today, and also providing really needed representation for the many communities that you're a part of. With that, just want to give a huge thanks to all of our presenters today, to all of the staff at PrideNet and the researchers and our community network that make up PrideNet. And most of all, huge thanks to participants and all the attendees that joined today. Thank you for your commitment to LGBTQIA+ health, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you tomorrow and later this week. Take care, everyone. Thanks so much.